Are we headed for a winter lockdown, with some restrictions described as inadequate, calls for tougher COVID tiers when England's lockdown ends? As new measures are about to be introduced in Scotland, fears that England's scheduled lifting of restrictions may not be possible.
Mr. Speaker, it is too early to do the analysis that the honourable gentleman requests, but of course we remain vigilant.
We'll soon be asked to make a decision on the future of the lockdown, so the earlier we get that information, the better.
COVID deaths rise for the 9th week in a row. 2,225 died in the UK last week alone, up by more than 600 the week before. So, how festive is this Christmas likely to be? I'm going to be talking to our health editor. Also, this lunchtime, anger as Boris Johnson describes devolution as a disaster in Scotland, and Tony Blair's biggest mistake. A BBC investigation into the awarding of PPE government contracts shows £21 million of taxpayers' money was paid in consulting fees to a recently formed firm in Miami, Florida. EasyJet reports its first annual loss in the airline's 25-year history as the coronavirus crisis continues to bite. Now the work begins. After the first successful docking with a commercial rocket, astronauts get down to business on the International Space Station.
Coming up in the sport later in the hour on BBC News, an exciting afternoon ahead at the ATP Tour Finals as Rafa Nadal prepares to take on Dominic Thiem in London.
Good afternoon and welcome to the BBC News at 1. Are we in for a particularly bleak midwinter? After the euphoria over news of potential vaccines, the harsh reality that COVID restrictions are still with us and could be about to be strengthened. England's lockdown is supposed to end in just 2.5 weeks' time, but in the House of Commons, the Health Secretary couldn't give any guarantees. This as some health experts are arguing for tougher tiers to be introduced in England. It could all mean a less than festive Christmas period. Our health correspondent Anna Collinson reports.
In just 7 days, 2 potential coronavirus vaccines have provided real hope of normality returning. Both the Moderna and the Pfizer jab are yet to be approved, but millions of doses have been ordered, and St John Ambulance says its volunteers will support the NHS when it's time.
Call of the day, so we're just around London.
We will train, first of all, our 10,000 already trained clinical volunteers. They will have additional training to go into service in a vaccination programme. And then we will move on to recruiting volunteers from outside of St John Ambulance, from a range of other voluntary organisations, making sure that they've got the requisite skills to function in a vaccination centre.
The most at risk of the virus will be first in line to receive a vaccine, starting with those who live and work in care homes. But the vaccine is a way off yet, and we still have winter to get through. With England's lockdown due to end on December the 2nd, there are calls for the COVID tier system to be strengthened. Currently, there are 3 levels. Medium level is the base, where the rule of 6 and the 10 p.m. hospitality curfew apply. High alert is next, which means there's no household mixing indoors, and the rule of 6 applies outdoors. The most severe level is very high, which means no mixing of household indoors or outdoors. Pubs and bars are closed unless they provide a substantial meal. It's claimed Tier 1 had very little effect on reducing transmission, while the creation of a new Tier 4 has been suggested. The Health Secretary says the current measures are being reviewed, but it's too early to say how they will proceed. Labour, though, wants answers.
Can he confirm that it's the government's intention to impose a tougher set of restrictions on Tier 1 areas post this lockdown?
Mr. Speaker, it is too early to do the analysis that the honourable gentleman requests, but of course we remain vigilant.
We'll soon be asked to make a decision on the future of the lockdown, so the earlier we get that information, the better.
Excess deaths are the difference between those seen this year and what we'd expect based on the past 5 years. Latest figures show there have been more than 70,000 since the pandemic started. This graph shows a huge spike in the number of deaths during the first wave, and the numbers are now starting to rise again. Winter is always a difficult time for the NHS. With fears of staff burnout, the government is desperate to minimise the damaging impact of COVID.
unfortunately, I've been in a position where I've actually lost colleagues this year to COVID-19. And for myself personally, I've been in a situation where I've been treating some of the illest patients with COVID-19 on COVID wards and in emergency medicine on the front line. And you do wonder, could this be you next?
While England waits for a vaccine, waits for new restrictions, one thing that is certain is December will be different this year. Anna Collinson, BBC News.
Well, our health editor, Hugh Pym, is here with me. Now, I don't want to put too much pressure on you, but what's Christmas looking like?
Well, Simon, very unclear. And of course, everyone wants to know about the Christmas holiday season, what might be permissible, how much might people be allowed to mix in family, households and so on. And you heard from Matt Hancock, the Health Secretary's rather abrupt answer there. It's still too early to say. It's a very, very big decision for ministers in England to make about what will happen after December the 2nd, how the tiered restrictions will continue. We heard yesterday from a senior official at Public Health England that a slight tightening of the restrictions within each tier might well be necessary through the winter, never mind in the run-up to Christmas. She said, Susan Hopkins of PHE, said that Tier 1 really hadn't worked at all. Only some parts of Tier 2 had worked, and the most effective set of restrictions were in Tier 3 plus, adding on some things, for example, in Liverpool with more widespread closures than the government's basic baseline, that they had begun to work just before the lockdown. So ministers will have to decide which areas go into which tier after December the 2nd, whether they will be tighter in some areas, and then if there's going to be any relaxation in the run up to Christmas, how that will be managed, and whether there will be an immediate tightening straight after Christmas. The Cabinet Office are looking at all this, I'm told. They're looking at the case data each day. They want to be able to see that cases are coming down because of the lockdown in England. That won't probably become clear till later this week. And then they've got to weigh the whole thing up with this absolutely critical decision, and we'll be hearing later in Scotland how they're going to proceed. Absolutely critical decision for everybody, what will happen through December up until Christmas and beyond.
Hugh, thank you very much. Yes, and as Hugh was saying, in the next hour, Nicola Sturgeon will announce whether parts of Scotland will be moved into the country's highest tier of COVID-19 restrictions. That's level 4. The First Minister will address Parliament at Holyrood, but she's previously said it likely some areas of Scotland will face tougher restrictions for a limited period. Well, our Scotland correspondent Alexandra Mackenzie is in Glasgow. What are we expecting to hear, Alexandra?
Well, it has been hinted at for several days that some areas of Scotland would be moved from level 3 into the highest level, level 4, which is the closest to lockdown. Now, those areas are likely to be the Greater Glasgow and Clyde Health Board area and North and South Lanarkshire. So that's around 1.8 million people that would be affected. Now, the schools will remain open. That's been a priority of the Scottish Government. But the areas that would be affected, non-essential shops would need to close, as would gyms, as would hairdressers and hospitality as well, apart from takeaway. So a real blow to these businesses as we come up to Christmas. But also it's the hope that if areas do move into level 4, then the closer to Christmas we get, then some restrictions might be able to ease, but there's obviously no guarantee of that. Now, Nicola Sturgeon made the point yesterday that things are not getting worse in Scotland. It's just in some areas the figures have been stubbornly high and more restrictions are needed to try and knock these figures down. Now, the First Minister has also said that she will look at possibly easing the restrictions in some areas, that it's not always going to be a one-way street.
Alexandra, thanks very much. A campaign group is planning to take legal action against the government over the awarding of contracts for NHS personal protective equipment to a recently formed Miami firm. Court documents in Florida, which have been seen by BBC News, reveal that as part of the contract, £21 million of taxpayers' money was paid in consulting fees to a go-between in Spain. Well, our special correspondent Lucy Manning joins me now. Lucy, tell us more.
Well, let's start at the beginning. It's a jewellery firm in Miami, and the owner of that, a man called Michael Sager, decided during the COVID crisis that he would get into the PPE business. He had business contacts in China, So he told the magazine, as well as designing his new jewellery collection, he was going to source PPE. And the British government gave him contracts for PPE for the NHS. We know at least £200 million worth of contracts, but they haven't all been published. Now, Mr. Sager hired a go-between to help him with this contract, a Spanish businessman, a man called Gabriel Anderson. And because the two men have had a dispute, it's gone to court in America, and we've got to see some of the court papers. It's lifted the lid on what the money is being spent on. And in the court papers, it makes clear that this go-between, who was supposed to source places and factories to get the PPE, to help with the logistics, to help with the shipping, Mr. Anderson got given $28 million in what's called in the court papers consulting fees. So for consulting, he got nearly £21 million. And there was supposed to be more contracts. He was supposed to get more money. He was supposed to get another $20 million. But there's now a legal dispute whether he helped out or not. And the Good Law Project, the campaigning group, is planning to take the government to the UK courts on this deal, asking why so much money was paid out. Just to tell you, the Sager company says at the height of the pandemic, when the NHS was in need of PPE, they delivered for Britain on time and at value, and they do hire extra staff to help with these big contracts.
Lucy Manning, thank you. Now, as we continue to report on the impact of the second wave, the BBC has been given rare access to the coronavirus ward at a community hospital. In the last month, 7 people have died with the virus at Clacton's nurse-run hospital. Staff say they're seeing more complex cases and are busier than ever. Simon Dedman reports.
The coronavirus ward at Clacton Hospital. The BBC has been given exclusive access as it's getting busier.
We have seen a big increase of cases coming in.
Staff are doing their best to keep it going. It's hard. It's hard on everybody, really.
Debbie Dyer is the clinical lead of this nurse-led hospital.
Because I'm going into an area where all the patients in there are still COVID positive. So we need to ensure that we're protecting ourselves, but also protecting the rest of the patients as well.
There are 21 patients with COVID.
Hello, Sheila. We keep doing your swabs. So we're doing them every 5 days, and as soon as we can get that negative, then we can get you home. All right?
Care homes are not taking anyone without a negative test result. It means most will be here for at least 14 days. 69-year-old Gerald Cripps, a former bus driver and carer from Harwich, caught COVID after having his leg amputated. He's been here for more than a month.
I feel okay. I feel fine. And the only thing is I'm waiting for the coronavirus to near enough go. It's near enough gone, so I can go home. What can you do? You live on, don't you?
It's getting busier here at Clacton Hospital. 3/4 of the COVID beds are full with patients aged between 57 and 99, and 2 more are on their way from Colchester.
The staff at the moment are quite emotional. We've had quite a few deaths, and it's quite hard managing staff that are emotional.
A majority of those nurses have had COVID. Mary Lou was the first in March and off work for 3 months. She and some colleagues still feel the effects.
Now I still have the shortness of breath when I go up the stairs. And I also experienced the losing of hair for a month.
Staff here think they have not reached the peak yet and expect to have every bed full in a few weeks. But
if people don't take it seriously enough, we could end up with this still in spring.
That could mean more COVID-19 admissions here in 2021. Simon Dedman, BBC News, Clacton Hospital.
It's a tough time for small retailers at the moment. All non-essential shops in England were forced to close for the second lockdown. Many small shops have been forced to innovate in order to survive. Sarah Corker reports.
Taking on the cobbled streets and narrow lanes of the Calder Valley, delivery rider Beata is Hebden Bridge's version of Amazon and Deliveroo combined.
This is Bertha, and she's just great. She's done, I think, about 1,500 miles since we started doing this, so she's worked really hard.
Beata and her electric bike Bertha are part of a team of 16 couriers. This business was set up as demand grew for local deliveries from local shops during lockdown.
So what kind of things do you deliver?
Oh my goodness, we've delivered everything from vintage clothing down through organic vegetables to, you know, things that need to be kept cool. We've got chiller boxes.
Today she's doing the cheese run. The Crumbly cheese is the latest retailer to start delivering by bike. When pubs and cafes shut, Andrew's wholesale trade disappeared, but he's managed to pick up new customers.
It works brilliantly for us. People can access, those that are shielding, that are stuck indoors, they can access what we do, and then it's delivered to their door without any worries.
With non-essential shops in England shut for a second time, the British Retail Consortium estimates £2 billion worth of sales will be lost every week during November. It's forced independents to try new things. A group called Totally Locally has helped 69 retailers here in Hebden Bridge come together to set up an online shopping site for the town.
This lockdown, we're now ready to be online. We weren't before. You know, this is our busiest time of year and we have to maintain some sort of retail presence even through lockdown.
And another set of teeth should do it. And if you live in the Calder Valley, you can also get these nostalgia-inducing sweets from your childhood delivered to your home or click and collect them.
I think that's a really good thing about small businesses. It's what we do best. It's about adapting.
And how important is it that you can keep doing some kind of trade through all of this?
Vital, because it was a long lockdown last time. It was a lot of work to do deliveries, and it's a lot quieter this time, so it's really good, this idea.
For many small retailers, 2020 has been the hardest year they've ever known. But collaborating, innovating and getting online fast is helping them to move forward during this second shutdown. Sarah Corker, BBC News in Hebden Bridge.
Boris Johnson has come under fire for reportedly telling a virtual meeting of Conservative MPs that devolution had been a disaster in Scotland. The SNP and Labour have both criticised the Prime Minister, but the government says Mr Johnson has always supported devolution. Chris Mason reports.
1999 and the return of a Scottish Parliament for the first time in nearly 300 years. Devolution in action, the transfer of power away from Westminster, described like this by the then First Minister, Labour's Donald Dewar.
The past is part of us, part of every one of us, and we respect it. But today there is a new voice in the land, the voice of a democratic parliament, a voice to shape Scotland, a voice, above all, for the future.
The Conservatives opposed devolution then, they now support it. And yet look at what the Prime Minister told a group of his MPs last night. It has been, he reportedly said, a disaster north of the border, and was Tony Blair's biggest mistake.
This is something that we hear all the time about Boris Johnson. Oh, he didn't mean to say that. He meant to say something different, as various ministers are sent out to apologise for him. But he did mean that. That is what he thinks about devolution.
The Scottish National Party want another independence referendum like the one in 2014, perhaps as soon as next year, and they'll campaign for one at the Scottish Parliament elections in May.
Okay, family, no problem.
Labour and the Conservatives will say the opposite. The Scottish Conservative leader says he'll speak to the Prime Minister later about his remarks and adds,
Well, I've said devolution is not the problem. The problem has been the SNP Scottish Government's obsession over their last 13 and a half years in power with separating Scotland from the rest of the United Kingdom.
We do not think the rather Neanderthal views that have been expressed by Boris Johnson get anybody any further, except to say it really does expose the underlying thinking and philosophy in Downing Street.
Opinion polls suggest there is overwhelming support for the Scottish Parliament for devolution in Scotland and growing support for independence.
We've now had 13 opinion polls in a row dating from the summer of this year, all of which have shown a majority for yes. This is the first time in Scottish polling history that we've had that kind of record.
Like an X-ray on a fractured bone, the pandemic and Brexit have portrayed in black and white the tensions in how the UK is now governed. The Prime Minister's comments electrify that debate as far as Scotland's future is concerned, a debate that's only going to get louder. Chris Mason, BBC News at Westminster.
It's 1:20. Our top story this lunchtime. Fears that England's scheduled lifting of coronavirus restrictions may not be possible as new measures are about to be introduced in Scotland. Still to come, we have a special investigation in which Indian factory workers working to supply some major British supermarkets say they're being routinely exploited.
Coming up in the sport in the next 15 minutes on BBC News, a winning knock from the England captain Heather Knight. She scores an unbeaten half-century for Sydney Thunder in the Big Bash in Australia.
Tesco, Sainsbury's and Marks & Spencer say they're reviewing working practices at one of their Indian suppliers after a BBC investigation found evidence workers were being exploited. Women at a factory which makes home textiles for the brands say they were forced to work excessive hours and weren't even allowed toilet breaks. The BBC's also heard claims of poor working conditions from staff at an independent supplier to Ralph Lauren. Regina Vajanathan reports.
In the world of fashion, they're the forgotten. The women who make our clothes. A million miles from the catwalk, they often live in dire poverty. Their monthly salaries, barely enough to feed their families. But these women produce garments for some of the world's biggest brands.
Ralph's talent, beyond creating beautiful things, is his talent to recognize people.
Ralph Lauren's clothes don't come cheap, but women we spoke to say they're paying a far higher price. Workers at one South Indian factory which supplies the label earn as little as £2.50 a day, making clothes which sell for hundreds. They say they're forced to work punishing hours to finish orders and even end up sleeping on the factory floor.
We are made to work continuously, often through the night, sleeping at 3 a.m., then waking up by 5 for another full day of work. Our bosses don't care. They're only bothered about production.
They ask us to work so late. I can't even feed my children at night. They shouldn't treat us like slaves. They should give us respect.
In a statement, Ralph Lauren said it was deeply concerned by the allegations and will investigate. We require all of our suppliers to meet strict operating standards to ensure a safe, healthy and ethical workplace, and we conduct regular third-party audits at all factories. The factory concerned has denied all allegations. We also talked to female staff at another Indian supplier which produces home furnishings for big British brands such as Tesco, Marks & Spencer and Sainsbury's. Speaking from their village, the women told us they're made to work in appalling conditions, which would be unthinkable for employees of the same brands in the UK.
We're not given time to drink water. We're not even given time to use the bathroom. We barely get time to eat lunch.
They have increased our workload. We are forced to stay late to finish it, or they yell at us and threaten to fire us. We are scared.
In statements, all three supermarkets said they were shocked and troubled to hear the reports. Sainsbury's said it's insisting on a number of actions the supplier must take in order for us to continue to work with them. Tesco's told us that plan includes prohibiting excessive overtime, strengthening grievance procedures and ensuring workers are fully compensated at the correct rates for the hours they've worked. While Marks & Spencer said it has a robust plan in place and would be undertaking regular, unannounced audits to ensure its implementation. Earlier in the year, there was an outcry after allegations of exploitation emerged in British factories supplying the fashion label Boohoo. But activists say the bigger issue lies in Asia, where most of our clothes are made.
Exploitation happens for the people who make our clothes around the world on a regular basis. But, you know, it's out of view and people aren't engaging with who those people are. But brands really have a responsibility to look at what's happening in their supply chains and say, are those people being treated fairly? Are those people being exploited?
As consumers chase cheaper clothes and brands bank bigger profits, it seems that the exploitation of the women who make them is one thing that hasn't gone out of fashion. Regina Vaidyanathan, BBC News, India.
EasyJet has made a loss for the first time in its history. The airline lost nearly £1.3 billion in the year to the end of September. Well, Ben Thompson is in West London and can tell us more. Ben.
Simon, yes, this year marks EasyJet's 25th anniversary, but it's not the sort of birthday celebration the airline would want. It is instead celebrating with the biggest loss and the first loss in its history. Now, it's not surprising given that the planes and the fleet for EasyJet was grounded for 11 weeks at the height of the UK lockdown. Now, there was some improvement over the summer, but of course, it is now operating at just 20% of its normal capacity. There are still big questions about things like testing, quarantine and of course the availability of a vaccine. Well, speaking to me this morning, the chief exec of EasyJet told me he'd written to the Prime Minister offering the airline's services to transport and also potentially administer a new vaccine. This is what he told me about how it might work.
We have the largest fleet of aircraft in the UK, so those would be available in order to distribute the vaccine. Also, we have up to 4,000 people of our fantastic crew that are trained, in first aid. They would be able and they would be, ready to assist in any way we can in order to get the rollout of the vaccination programs done in a swift and an efficient way.
And for all airlines, that vaccine could be a real game changer to get back to some sort of normality. But it's not expected that the airline industry can return to normal until at least 2023. Long-haul travel could take even longer. Business travel may be changed forever. But most of this will rely on our confidence and feeling safe once again to travel.
Ben, thank you very much. The England and Wales Cricket Board has been accused of institutionalised racism by two former umpires. They want an independent inquiry into the lack of ethnic minority match officials in the English game. Katie Gornall reports.
This summer, cricket made a collective statement, joining global attempts to raise awareness about institutional racism in society. But not for the first time, the domestic game is being urged to look closer to home and address its own lack of diversity. John Holder spent nearly 30 years as a professional umpire before his retirement 11 years ago. Since then, no non-white umpires have been elevated to the first-class umpires panel. He believes the England and Wales Cricket Board is structurally racist.
The fact that a few non-white umpires, several non-white umpires have made inquiries about going on the first-class umpires panel and none have progressed. That looks more than suspicious to me.
In a statement, the ECB said, "Today's group of professional umpires don't reflect the diverse ECB we are determined to be. We want to see more BAME representation among our officials and recognise we still have a long way to go as a game to achieve this." Holder has been joined by Ishmael Darwood, a former county cricket keeper and umpire, in calling for an independent investigation.
There's systematic blockages that have been allowed to be put in place and will still be kept in place if they are not thoroughly investigated. We are having minimal representation of BAME cricket players, BAME coaches, BAME umpires and officials, BAME CEOs. The barriers is far greater than non-BAME. That's a fact.
Their allegations come following Azim Rafiq's claim of institutional racism at his former club Yorkshire, who have opened their own inquiry. English cricket is having to face some uncomfortable truths as it tries to increase diversity and prove that the game is a game for all. Katie Gornall, BBC News.
Now, it's never the easiest of manoeuvres, but parking 250 miles above the Earth presents particular difficulties, even though there's plenty of space.
Soft capture confirmed.
Well, they managed it. No problem, as you can see, for the crew on board the private spacecraft SpaceX as it docked with the International Space Station. The crew will now spend 6 months doing experiments in space. Victoria Gill reports.
Victor here. Baby Yoda and I wanted to talk to you a little bit about the hatches. Just about 24 hours ago, we entered resilience through this side hatch.
The end of a 27-hour taxi ride to space.
Again, this is a view looking at Dragon from station from the Node 2 forward port that Dragon will be docking to today.
For the first time, 4 astronauts arrived to start their mission at the International Space Station aboard a commercial spacecraft. The entire trip on the SpaceX Dragon capsule, including the millimetre-perfect docking procedure, was fully automated.
Dragon SpaceX, soft capture confirmed.
It's a milestone in the nearly £2.5 billion deal that NASA signed with Elon Musk's aerospace company to develop, test and fly an astronaut taxi service. The astronauts on this flight, NASA's Michael Hopkins, Victor Glover and Shannon Walker, and the Japanese Space Agency astronaut Soichi Noguchi, will spend 6 months in space. And in another history-making moment, Victor Glover joined the International Space Station to become its first African-American crew member.
And here's Victor Glover.
There are now 7 people living and working on the station, tripling its capacity to carry out scientific research in microgravity.
It was an amazing ride. I can't tell you how excited we were when that rocket lifted off the pad, and then the last 27 hours has gone really smooth, actually.
UK astronaut Tim Peake returned from his own 6-month mission in 2016.
We're doing about 14-hour days, 7 in the morning until 7 at night, and then we'd have a couple of hours preparation in the evening. And the majority of that is science activities. And then at the weekend, the crew will try and just drop the tempo because you're up there for 6 months. It's a marathon. You know, you can't go all out all of the time.
When this crew's marathon mission is done in 2021, their private space taxi will be waiting to bring them home. Victoria Gill, BBC News.
Let's have a look at the weather. The forecast now with Stav Donaire. Stav.
Thanks very much, Simon. Good afternoon to you. Well, we're sticking with the mild theme again today. Very mild indeed for the time of year across much of the country, but it is quite breezy and rather cloudy out there. It's not completely dry either. We've got this weather front bringing some wet weather to western Scotland, but you'll notice a lot of isobars on the charts indicating that strong breeze, and it's this warm air coming up from the Azores, hence it's so mild. But it is very cloudy. You can just make out the outline of the British Isles there. A lot of cloud around, some light rain for western parts of Wales, heavy rain for western Scotland, but you'll notice some holes in that cloud, northeast parts of Scotland and northeast England, some shelter there from the southwest breeze. So here it'll be very mild indeed, given some brightness, perhaps 17 or 18 degrees. But for most you can see around the mid-teens Celsius, even where we have thicker cloud across western areas. Now, as we head on through this evening and overnight, stays very wet for western Scotland. That rain begins to transfer in towards northern Scotland and into the northern Isles by the end of the night. Could see a little bit of rain for western parts of Northern Ireland, perhaps the very far southwest. But for most, we're holding on to a relatively dry night, a lot of cloud, breezy, and again, very mild. These are daytime values, or even higher than daytime values we expect this time of year. Now, as we head on into tomorrow, the pressure chart shows this area of low pressure, which will slowly push its way eastwards. That's a cold front, which will spread east through the day with some outbreaks of rain on it after a dry start in the east. Eventually, that rain will reach eastern areas. Behind it, it brightens up, sunshine, some blustery showers, but it will be turning much colder with single values here. And it stays cold, windy and very wet all day for the Northern Isles, particularly across Shetland. Mild rain across the southeast, but it won't last. A plunge of cold air sinks southwards during Wednesday night right across the UK and into Thursday as well. But it'll be short-lived because waiting out in the wings is a plume of milder air, but with another frontal system that'll bring outbreaks of rain for Friday. Lots of isobars on the chart, you'll notice, for Thursday across the north and the east of the country. So here it's going to start very windy with gales, northern and eastern areas, and a much colder feel to all areas, particularly across Scotland, where we'll have some wintry showers through the day, mixture of rain, sleet and snow. Further south and west, though, that ridge of high pressure will settle things down, so we should see quite a bit of sunshine into the afternoon, the wind's slowly easing. But it's going to be a cold day, just about double figures in the south, low single digits in the north. But those temperatures will slowly recover as we head through Thursday night to Friday, as it turns milder, wetter and windier, and it'll stay fairly unsettled into the weekend, particularly windy across Scotland and Northern Ireland through the course of the weekend. But across the south, it stays relatively mild. Simon.
Stav, thank you very much. A reminder of our top story. Fears that England's scheduled lifting of coronavirus restrictions may not be possible as new measures are about to be introduced in Scotland. That's all from the BBC News at 1 on BBC One. We now join the BBC's news teams where you are. From me, good afternoon.